Richard had forgotten his sons at their Los Angeles private school. When he finally arrived, he stopped at the top of the sweeping stone staircase of his Beverly Hills mansion, entirely motionless. The two boys were not running toward him in greeting. Instead, they were running toward Sarah the housekeeper, each holding an ice cream cone in their small hands. The name tumbling eagerly from their mouths was not their father's. Earlier that afternoon, Sarah had bolted from the service gate of the sprawling estate the very second she hung up the phone with the school office, without warning anyone or asking for permission, because there was simply no time for such formalities. In that fleeting moment, the only thing that carried any weight in the world was the fact that two little boys were sitting on a cold hallway bench, waiting for someone who was not showing up. She had not paused to consider whether retrieving the children fell within her official job description, nor did she stop to wonder if there was someone more qualified to handle the crisis. She certainly did not stand around staring at her cell phone, waiting for Richard to answer a fourth call, because 3 completely unanswered rings were more than enough of an answer for her. She simply grabbed her worn purse from the kitchen hook, texted her neighbor that she urgently needed to borrow her old sedan, and walked out the door with the keys gripped tightly in her hand. Her heart was beating in a rapid, heavy rhythm that did not stem from fear, but from absolute urgency. It was the specific kind of haste that surges through the blood when a person knows exactly what must be done and refuses to find a single excuse to delay it. The prestigious elementary school was located 14 blocks away from the lavish mansion, a distance that usually meant an 18-minute drive in the sluggish afternoon traffic of the city. Yet Sarah managed to complete the route in exactly 15 minutes, catching the right traffic lights and moving with a physical determination that left absolutely no room for hesitation. When she pushed open the heavy glass door of the administrative office, Miss Higgins, the school secretary, rose from her desk with an expression of profound visible relief. The children had been sitting there for 2 full hours, and the primary emergency contact listed in their digital system had ignored all 3 frantic phone calls. Sarah did not waste breath on explanations. She walked straight over to the wooden bench where the 2 boys were waiting. Matthew was sitting with his small hands tightly interlaced in his lap, his eyes fixed firmly on the polished floor tiles, and his jaw slightly clenched. It was the universal posture of older children who are desperately trying to hold on to emotions they refuse to let spill in front of strangers. Beside him, David sat, with his oversized backpack resting on his knees, swinging his legs that did not quite reach the ground. He kept darting his eyes toward the hallway every time a sound echoed, holding on to that pure, heartbreaking expectation of a very young child who still believes their parent will magically appear the next time the door opens. The moment David saw Sarah walk into the room, he dropped his heavy backpack onto the floor and leaped off the wooden bench without a second thought. Sarah dropped to her knees before he could even reach her, opening her arms wide as the little boy crashed into her embrace with his entire body weight, holding nothing back and measuring nothing. He just surrendered. Matthew took a bit longer, watching them silently for a brief second, before slowly standing up and walking toward her with cautious steps. When he got close enough, she gently wrapped one arm around his small shoulders, not forcing the affection, not squeezing too tightly. She just offered the shelter, and he leaned into it without pulling away, resting his forehead just against her collarbone and taking one single deep breath. That one shaky exhalation communicated everything the young boy was too proud to say out loud. Sarah stayed kneeling on the floor, holding both boys for a long while, feeling the physical weight of their exhaustion against her own body. She smelled the familiar scent of the classroom, the stale lunch packed away in their bags since early morning, and the distinct aura of children who had waited entirely too long in a place where they were not meant to wait. She said absolutely nothing to them, understanding that there were no words capable of expressing what her steady embrace was already saying with far more precision than any practiced speech. When she finally pulled back, she adjusted Matthew's backpack onto his shoulders, with both hands checked the zipper on David's bag to ensure nothing would fall, and gave a polite nod of gratitude to Miss Higgins, who was watching the tender scene with the quiet curiosity of someone witnessing a profoundly unexpected grace. Sarah simply said it was time to go, and there was no trace of anger in her voice, no lingering resentment, and no heavy burden of obligation. It was just the calm, reassuring tone of someone who was present and fully intended to remain present. Hearing that the two boys walked out flanking her on either side, David unconsciously held on to the edge of her simple apron, marching down the school corridor toward the bright California sun with that specific, hurried step children adopt when they feel a massive wave of relief, but lack the vocabulary to explain it. Once inside the borrowed car, David pressed his face against the window with wide, fascinated eyes, treating the mundane drive through the Los Angeles streets as if it were a grand new adventure, a beautiful trait Sarah had long admired in the youngest boy. Matthew remained perfectly quiet on the other side of the back seat, keeping his backpack resting on his lap, even though there was plenty of space on the upholstery beside him. He stared out the glass, not looking at the palm trees or the passing luxury cars, but staring with the blank intensity of a child, silently processing a deep disappointment that was not yet ready to be spoken. Sarah drove cautiously, constantly checking the rearview mirror to look at the boys with every turn of the wheel. There was a tight knot of tension in her shoulders she could not fully release, fully aware that returning to the mansion meant facing a complicated reality. She was not their legal guardian. She was simply the hired help of that affluent household, and she had crossed an unspoken boundary without authorization. But as they pulled into the grand driveway, she knew she did not regret a single thing. When the sedan finally rolled to a stop near the towering front gates of the estate, Matthew spoke, without tearing his gaze away from the tinted window, quietly asking if she had known they were left stranded there all along. Sarah looked at his reflection in the rearview mirror, listening as the boy logically pointed out that even though the office called her, she was not contractually obligated to come to their rescue. She did not answer him right away, choosing instead to put the car in park, remove the keys from the ignition, and rest her hands on the steering wheel for a brief, heavy moment. Then she turned her body slightly to look the young boy directly in the eye, telling him softly but firmly that nobody was ever going to be left waiting as long as she had the power to do something about it. Matthew held her gaze through the reflection for a long, quiet second that felt far more significant than any normal silence between a child and an adult. He then unbuckled his seatbelt, pushed the heavy car door open, and stepped out onto the driveway without uttering another word. Yet, there was a distinct shift in the way he moved. In the confident manner, he hoisted his backpack over his shoulder and patiently waited for his younger brother to climb out the other side. A stark contrast to the defeated posture he carried when he first entered the vehicle. Sarah mentally noted the subtle transformation, locking the observation away in her heart without making any verbal comment. Once they were safely inside the expansive, air-conditioned mansion, she quickly prepared a comforting snack, guiding the boys to the marble kitchen island. She mixed a tall glass of cold chocolate milk for David, whose face was still slightly creased from dozing off against the car window during the short ride. Then she walked over to the stainless steel freezer and pulled out 2 large ice cream cones, deciding that it was a Friday, and the day had simply been far too grueling to conclude without something sweet to soften the edges. Matthew ate his portion methodically, paying excessive attention to the simple act of eating, carefully cleaning the edges of the waffle cone as if trying to keep his mouth busy so he would not have to use it to discuss the afternoon. David, however, ate with sheer joy, laughing as the melting vanilla dripped carelessly down his small wrist, completely unbothered by the sticky mess. David was the type of child who existed entirely in the present moment, refusing to carry the crushing weight of what had happened hours before, or worrying about what might happen tomorrow. Sarah found this resilient quality both incredibly beautiful and entirely necessary, viewing him as the natural emotional counterbalance to his overly serious older brother. Leaning quietly against the granite counter, Sarah watched the two siblings and could not shake the feeling that something was fundamentally fractured inside this beautiful house, something that had absolutely nothing to do with the dust she swept or the floors she polished every morning. There was an unnatural, chilling silence lingering in the high-ceilinged rooms, an emptiness that decorated the corners of a home where everything functioned perfectly on the surface, but lacked a true soul. 40 minutes later, the heavy iron gates buzzed open, signaling Richard's arrival. Sarah heard the distinct purr of his luxury car pulling into the garage, followed by the sharp click of his leather shoes echoing against the stone walkway leading up to the main entrance. Instead of retreating to the kitchen, she stepped out onto the sunlit patio, with the two boys trailing closely beside her, having firmly decided she would not wait around to be summoned like a subordinate. If she waited to be called, the necessary conversation might be carefully managed and deflected, and she refused to let the events of the afternoon be swept under the expensive rugs. The boys still held their half-eaten treats. Matthew's was nearly finished, while David's was melting rapidly down the side, a sticky disaster he was struggling to contain. Richard ascended the wide front steps, holding his designer leather briefcase, his tailored suit perfectly buttoned as it always was, but he abruptly froze when he saw the three of them standing silently on the patio. He remained planted at the top of the stairs for a duration long enough to make everyone acutely aware of his hesitation before slowly descending the steps, one by one. His movements lacked their usual brisk executive authority. Normally, he walked with the aggressive momentum of a man who had his next 3 moves planned out before his foot even hit the ground. When he finally drew near, David trotted over briefly, wrapping his small arms around his father's leg, accidentally smearing a streak of melted ice cream against the dark wool trousers, before immediately darting back to stand securely beside Sarah's apron. Matthew did not move an inch from where he stood, clutching the remnants of his cone, while glaring at his father with an expression devoid of simple childish anger. Anger would have carried warmth motion and a desperate plea for attention, but the look painted across the 10-year-old's face was infinitely colder than a tantrum. It was the devastating gaze of a child who had painfully learned to stop expecting greatness from someone, having already spent all his hope and realized the investment was utterly worthless. Richard absorbed the blow of that stare, standing awkwardly in his own luxurious courtyard, and the expression that washed over his face was stripped of its corporate armor. It was the vulnerable, exposed look of a man suddenly colliding with a harsh reality he had successfully kept locked outside his doors for far too long. He quietly admitted that he knew he was late, his voice emerging hollow and lacking the commanding resonance it usually held during board meetings. Matthew stared back without a single blink, reminding his father, with a voice entirely too steady for a child, that they had sat on that bench for 2 agonizing hours, waiting for him. Richard briefly closed his tired eyes, reopened them without offering a single fragile excuse, and immediately shifted his gaze over to Sarah, whispering a quiet, "Thank you." She did not say a word in response, knowing it was neither the time nor the place to offer absolution. She simply gathered the heavy backpacks from the stone floor, handed them to the boys, and announced she was going to prepare supper. As she walked away, she could hear the thick, painfully honest silence settling between the father and his sons, a quietness far heavier than any shouting match could ever be. Later that night, well past midnight, after the boys had been tucked into their beds, and the massive house had settled into that specific heavy quietude unique to empty mansions, Richard walked into the kitchen. Sarah was just finishing wiping down the marble sink, her hands still damp, and a clean dishcloth draped casually over her shoulder, when she heard his cautious footsteps echo in the corridor and turned around. He had shed his expensive suit jacket. The top button of his crisp shirt was undone, and standing there under the warm kitchen lights, he looked significantly smaller than the imposing executive he pretended to be during the day. He stood near the archway for a long moment, not out of fear, but like a deeply exhausted man, desperately trying to arrange his heavy thoughts into the correct order before speaking. He finally broke the silence, telling her in a low voice that she had not been under any professional obligation to go to the school and pick them up. Sarah calmly dried her hands on the cloth, folded it with meticulous care, placed it neatly on the edge of the counter, and replied that she was perfectly aware it was not her job. Richard looked at her, his brow furrowed in genuine confusion, and asked why she had done it then. She met his gaze with absolute clarity, offering no judgment but delivering a simple truth. She went because two little boys were sitting entirely alone, and she had the ability to go. She explained that she did not need a grander reason or a contractual clause to do the right thing when children were hurting. Richard remained completely silent for a long stretch of time after she spoke, staring at the floor as if he were passing her simple, profound words through a complex internal filter. When he finally looked back up, he promised her in a voice barely above a whisper that a mistake like that would never happen again. Sarah picked up her modest jacket draped over a wooden chair, picked up her purse, and began walking toward the back door to head home for the night. As she brushed past him in the hallway, he called out her name using a tone that lacked the usual distance between an employer and an employee, repeating his vow with desperate firmness. She paused, looked over her shoulder for 2 full seconds, and walked out the door without saying a word, knowing from harsh life experience that midnight promises required the harsh light of day to prove their worth. Over the course of the following days, an invisible but profound shift began to alter the rhythm of the Beverly Hills estate, arriving without grand announcements or dramatic declarations. Richard started coming home early from his downtown office. He was not perfectly punctual every single day, but he appeared with a frequency that had previously been non-existent in their lives. On a Tuesday afternoon, he walked through the front door at exactly 6 o'clock and bypassed the kitchen entirely, heading straight upstairs to the boys' bedrooms instead of standing in the foyer aggressively checking his corporate emails. By Thursday, he arrived at 5:30, took off his tie, and actually sat down with Matthew and David at the dining table to share a hot meal, keeping his phone switched off and placed face down on the tablecloth. There was a distinctly different energy in the air during that dinner, primarily because Richard stayed seated until everyone was finished refusing to abandon the table to take business calls from Mr. Henderson, the firm's senior partner. When David accidentally knocked over his heavy glass of cold apple juice, Richard did not tense up with the irritation of a man whose perfectly controlled environment had been disrupted. Instead, he calmly grabbed a stack of cloth napkins and knelt on the floor to help his youngest son wipe up the sticky puddle, speaking in a gentle, reassuring tone. Sarah moved quietly around the dining room, serving plates and clearing dishes without uttering a word, observing the tiny, meaningful gestures that proved true. Change was taking root in the quiet moments when he thought no one was paying attention. The following Wednesday afternoon, while Sarah was mopping the long hardwood corridor on the second floor, the heavy oak door of the home office swung open, and Richard nearly tripped over her yellow bucket. He immediately apologized in a natural, friendly tone, completely devoid of the sharp annoyance he usually exhibited whenever his important work was unexpectedly interrupted by the household staff. Sarah smiled politely, assuring him it was no problem at all, and reached down to pull the soapy bucket out of his path. When she stood back up, she realized he was still standing there, leaning against the doorframe and looking at her with a level of genuine human attention she had never received from him before. He asked her exactly how long she had been working in their house, his question carrying a sincere curiosity rather than the tone of an employer conducting a routine performance review. She answered that it had been 2 years and 3 months since she first took the job. He nodded slowly, seemingly weighing the length of time against his own lack of awareness, and then gently asked if she had any family living in Los Angeles. Sarah replied that it was just her and her aging mother living in a small apartment across the sprawling city. Richard absorbed the information quietly, offering a thoughtful nod as if safely storing the detail away in his mind before turning back into his office, leaving Sarah to wonder about the sudden change in his demeanor. Sarah continued pushing the mop down the sunlit hallway, but there was a distinctly different atmosphere lingering in the space, a quiet tension she could not accurately name. The brief conversation stayed securely lodged in her mind, for the remainder of the afternoon floating around her thoughts, like a question that had not yet taken a definitive shape. It felt as though a thick invisible wall that had rigidly separated their worlds for over 2 years was beginning to crack, letting in a strange, unscripted light. She finished her chores with a peculiar lightness in her chest, fully aware that the dynamics of the grand house were slowly rearranging themselves, shifting away from cold transactional duties toward something resembling genuine human connection. Several weeks later, Richard formally requested Sarah's presence in the main living room, a space usually reserved for entertaining wealthy guests or conducting serious business. She walked in carrying a mental checklist, assuming he wanted to discuss a new household protocol, a minor complaint regarding the laundry, or some other trivial issue she had handled dozens of times before. However, he was not standing tall in his usual commanding posture. Instead, he was sitting on the edge of the plush velvet sofa, his elbows resting heavily on his knees and his hands clasped tightly together. There was a raw, unfiltered seriousness etched across his face that had nothing to do with managing a household, looking very much like a man preparing to confess something that had taken massive courage to admit. He gestured toward the matching armchair and politely asked her to sit down, an invitation that had never been extended to her during her 2 years and 3 months of daily service. Sarah sat on the very edge of the expensive upholstery, keeping her posture perfectly straight and resting her worn hands in her lap, waiting patiently for him to speak. He looked directly at her and stated that he wanted to share something she had absolutely no professional obligation to hear, but that he firmly believed she deserved to know the truth. Sarah remained perfectly quiet, offering him the silent, respectful space required to unburden whatever heavy secret was pulling his broad shoulders down toward the floor. He took a slow breath and confessed that the boy's mother had packed her belongings and walked out of their lives exactly 1 year and 4 months ago. He clarified that it had not been a sudden explosive tragedy, but a calculated departure based on personal reasons he could intellectually comprehend, even if the boys were still too young to process the abandonment. He admitted with a painful crack in his voice that he had been failing his sons miserably ever since, fully aware of his shortcomings but entirely unable to figure out how to stop the downward spiral. Sarah kept her eyes locked on his face, refusing to look away out of awkwardness, and simply asked him why he was choosing to reveal such intimate family history to her. Richard answered that he was telling her because she consistently did far more to care for his children than he did, and he desperately needed her to know that he was not blind to the reality of his own home. Sarah let a few heavy seconds pass, allowing the absolute truth of his statement to hang in the air before responding with a voice completely stripped of flattery or hesitation. She told him directly that she cared for the house because it was her livelihood, and she genuinely loved the boys, but what those children fundamentally needed was a father, not a hired housekeeper. Richard stared at her, struck by the brutal honesty of a woman who refused to sugarcoat the truth, absorbing a profound lesson that pierced straight through his ego and demanded a better version of himself. By the time the weekend arrived, Richard's morning routine had drastically shifted. He was waking up an hour earlier, strictly to drive the boys to their private school himself, leaving his corporate driver waiting idle in the driveway. He strictly enforced a new rule at the dinner table, ensuring that no cell phones or tablets were allowed near the plates, demanding everyone be fully present. On a bright Friday afternoon, he walked through the front door, carrying a brand-new soccer ball tucked under his arm, loudly calling for Matthew to come out to the manicured garden for a match. Initially, the older boy approached the grass with extreme caution, guarding his fragile hopes, terrified to invest his emotions in a game that might be abruptly cancelled by a ringing telephone. But as the minutes ticked by and Richard ran across the lawn laughing and sweating in his dress shirt, the 10-year-old boy finally let his guard down, playing with the loud, unrestrained energy of a child who had finally been given permission to just be a kid. David stood safely on the grand veranda, shouting hilarious, nonsensical instructions that had absolutely nothing to do with the rules of soccer, his small face glowing with pure joy, just to be included in the moment. Standing quietly by the kitchen sink, Sarah washed the dinner vegetables while watching the beautiful chaos unfold through the large window, feeling a strange, wonderful lightness blooming inside her chest. Matthew was genuinely smiling again. Not the polite, guarded smirk he used for house guests, but a real, uncontainable smile that reached his eyes and vanished as quickly as it appeared. The following Saturday afternoon, while Sarah was out in the warm garden carefully taking down the dried laundry from the hidden clothesline, Richard walked across the stone patio, carrying 2 tall glasses of freshly squeezed lemonade. He simply extended one hand to offer her a glass, bypassing any awkward formalities or questions, and she calmly accepted it, their fingers barely brushing against the cool glass. They stood side by side in the golden afternoon light, listening to the boys shouting happily in the distance, sharing a peaceful silence that felt incredibly rare and entirely unforced. Out of nowhere, without any clumsy preamble, Richard turned to her and bluntly asked if she had ever seriously considered going back to school to further her own education. Sarah took a slow sip of her lemonade, letting the unexpected question settle before answering that she had thought about it often, but financial reality had never permitted such a luxury. He asked what she would study if money were no object, and she paused not out of indecision, but because it had been an incredibly long time since anyone had cared enough to ask about her personal dreams. When she softly answered that she wanted to study nursing, Richard looked out toward the garden and casually offered to pay for her entire tuition. Sarah immediately declined, insisting it was unnecessary, but Richard firmly stated that while he knew she did not need a savior, he genuinely wanted to help her build her future, leaving her standing in the garden with a head full of wild, terrifying hope. By the time the sun rose the next morning, the monumental decision had securely rooted itself deep within Sarah's heart, leaving absolutely no room for doubt or retreat. She moved efficiently through the kitchen, brewing the dark coffee, setting out the ceramic cereal bowls, packing David's bright lunchbox, and double-checking Matthew's homework folder, waiting for the perfect quiet moment to speak. When Richard finally descended the grand staircase earlier than usual, he took one look at her face and instantly knew she had reached a conclusion, noticing the subtle but fierce determination setting her jaw. After he returned from the school run, he found her in the brightly lit laundry room, methodically sorting the folded shirts, and he simply leaned against the door frame, giving her the floor. Sarah placed the last folded garment atop the neat stack, squared her shoulders, and told him with absolute directness that she would graciously accept his generous offer to fund her nursing education. However, she laid out strict, undeniable conditions. She demanded that the tuition be paid directly to the college, without any messy personal transfers, ensuring there would be zero confusion between genuine gratitude, a charitable favor, and a lingering financial debt. Richard listened patiently to every single word, without once trying to interrupt her, completely respecting her fierce need to maintain her personal dignity and establish clear boundaries. He did not attempt to romanticize the transaction or turn his financial aid into a grand emotional spectacle. And because he handled it so professionally, she finally believed he was entirely sincere. Within the same week, Richard instructed his trusted corporate administrator to finalize the college enrollment, strictly demanding that his name remain completely invisible on all the official paperwork, honoring Sarah's wishes to the letter. When he finally handed her the thick white envelope containing her class schedule and the fully paid receipt for the evening nursing program, he merely placed it gently on the kitchen island and mentioned that the logistics were settled. Sarah carefully opened the flap, read every single printed line with meticulous attention, and quietly tucked the documents into her worn purse without launching into an exaggerated speech of gratitude. She offered him a long, incredibly meaningful look that conveyed 1,000 unspoken words, knowing they had just cemented a profound, quiet trust that was exceedingly rare for two people from drastically different worlds. With the grueling college semester officially underway, the established routine inside the grand estate transformed completely to accommodate her demanding new reality. Sarah now rushed out the back door in the late afternoon, catching 2 different public buses to reach the sprawling campus, while Richard fiercely protected his calendar to guarantee he was parked in the driveway before 8 o'clock at least 4 nights a week. The initial adjustment period was remarkably difficult for him, having spent the last few years using his demanding career as a brilliant shield to avoid the terrifying responsibilities of single parenthood. Now, sitting at the head of the table, gently stopping David from spilling hot soup on his shirt and helping Matthew untangle complex math problems, Richard vividly saw everything he had been foolishly missing. He realized he had missed the tiny, irreplaceable details of their youth, the wobbly front tooth carefully saved in a small plastic container, the bizarre new nicknames David invented on a weekly basis, and the nervous way Matthew tugged at his sleeves. Sarah had been the sole witness to all these precious milestones, while he had been staring at spreadsheets, and the sharp sting of that realization cut deep. Yet it pushed him to be a better father, rather than paralyzing him with guilt. One evening, right in the middle of a messy dinner, little David suddenly looked up and asked his father if he was going to forget about the upcoming school play. Richard carefully placed his silver fork on the napkin, looked directly into his youngest son's anxious eyes, and firmly swore that he would be sitting in the very front row. Matthew looked up from his plate, his voice quiet but remarkably sharp, stating that this time they would just have to wait and see if the promise actually held true. Richard swallowed his pride, accepting the boy's lingering skepticism without offering a single defensive excuse, fully understanding that rebuilding a shattered childhood trust required far more than a single dinner conversation. Meanwhile, Sarah absorbed the intense pressure of her new double life, attending classes with younger students, constantly fighting exhaustion, and often returning to the quiet mansion long after the streets had emptied. Despite the dark circles blooming under her eyes, she never once complained. She would kick off her shoes, tie her hair back, warm up a cup of bitter coffee, and sit at the kitchen island to review her anatomy notes. Richard slowly developed a habit of waiting up for her, leaning against the counter, while she highlighted thick textbooks initiating short conversations about the mundane details of their respective days. Soon those brief chats expanded into long, deeply personal discussions where she shared stories about Professor Evans, her strict anatomy teacher, or Maria, a hard-working classmate from a rough neighborhood who managed to survive on 4 hours of sleep. In return, Richard stripped away his corporate facade, openly discussing his crippling fears, his past parental failures, and the terrifying vulnerability of trying to piece his fractured family back together. Sonia never offered him empty platitudes. She delivered honest, grounding advice, and her unwavering authenticity drew him closer than any calculated romantic gesture ever could have. The first real threat to their fragile new ecosystem arrived on a Sunday afternoon, wearing an expensive designer dress and carrying the sharp, judgmental gaze of Richard's older sister, Laura. Laura was a master of passive-aggressive elegance, always treating the household staff with a chilling, overly polite distance that clearly established her perceived superiority. During lunch, she noticed the undeniable warmth flowing between her brother and the housekeeper, observing how Richard constantly sought Sonia's eyes for silent reassurance during the chaotic meal. Later, catching Sarah alone on the patio, Laura offered a thinly veiled warning about the social dangers of employees overstepping their boundaries. But Sarah calmly looked the wealthy woman in the eye, replying that the only danger to the family had been the prolonged absence of the people supposed to be protecting those boys, leaving Laura completely speechless. When Laura finally drove her sleek sports car out of the estate gates later that evening, Richard instantly sensed the heavy discomfort radiating from Sarah's usually calm demeanor. He pressed her gently until she revealed the nature of the tense conversation on the patio, and his reaction was immediate, decisive, and completely devoid of his usual diplomatic hesitation. He firmly declared that absolutely no one, not even his own flesh and blood, had the right to diminish the sacred place she had rightfully earned within the walls of that house. The very next morning, he dialed his sister's private number and delivered a crystal-clear, uncompromising boundary, stating that Sarah was to be treated with the utmost respect, marking the first time he had defended her out of deep, undeniable conviction rather than simple gratitude. When Richard recounted the stern phone call to Sarah later that night in the quiet kitchen, he did not boast or seek a medal for his actions. He simply relayed the facts. Sarah absorbed the information, silently wiping down the clean counter, and softly replied that she never wanted to be the wedge that drove a permanent wedge between siblings. Richard immediately corrected her, his voice low and incredibly steady, explaining that establishing basic human decency was not starting a fight. It was simply drawing a necessary line in the sand. Sarah tucked that specific phrase deep into her memory, cherishing the quiet strength of a man who was finally learning how to protect the people under his roof. Meanwhile, the brutal reality of nursing school began to physically wear Sarah down, stacking thick textbooks, endless memorization, and demanding clinical rotations on top of her already strenuous household duties. She survived on hastily eaten sandwiches, on city buses, fighting the heavy pull of sleep every night while staring at complex diagrams of the human circulatory system under the harsh kitchen lights. Richard noticed her failing stamina and quietly stepped in to lighten her load without making a grand spectacle of his assistance. He started leaving freshly prepared meals, sealed in the refrigerator-ordered premium car services, on the nights the Los Angeles rain came down too hard, and frequently stayed awake just to keep her company while she studied. One terribly cold Tuesday night, after enduring a brutally difficult pharmacology exam, Sarah walked through the back door, looking utterly defeated, dropping her heavy bag onto the floor with a hollow thud. Richard was already waiting by the stove with a warm cup of herbal tea, and when he softly asked if she was all right, the dam finally broke. She whispered that she was incredibly tired of having to be the strong one every single second of her life, a raw confession that seemed to echo loudly off the expensive kitchen tiles. Richard gently pulled out a wooden chair, guided her to sit down, and told her with absolute sincerity that she never had to pretend to be invincible when she was inside that house. The emotional landscape of the mansion grew vastly more complicated when Victoria, the boy's absentee mother, suddenly sent a brief text message asking to see the children after more than a year of total silence. Richard was instantly thrown off balance pacing the long floors of his private library, his brow deeply furrowed as he stared at the glowing screen of his cell phone, terrified of making a catastrophic mistake. Sarah noticed his sudden return to his old, anxious habits and patiently waited until Matthew and David were fast asleep before asking him directly what heavy burden had returned to haunt him. When he confessed that Victoria was demanding a reunion claiming she had changed, Sarah listened with her entire being before offering her quiet, profound wisdom. She firmly told him that the emotional stability of young children should never be used as a testing ground for a guilty adult trying to ease her own conscience. She advised him that if Victoria truly wished to re-enter their fragile lives, she had to move exclusively at the pace the boys dictated without forcing sudden affection or demanding instant forgiveness. Richard agreed completely, leaning heavily on Sarah's emotional clarity, marveling at the sheer grace of a woman who chose to fiercely protect his children, rather than give in to petty jealousy or insecurity regarding her own evolving place in the family. That specific conversation solidified something massive inside his chest. He realized the depth of her character was rarer than anything he had ever encountered in his privileged life. The long-awaited reunion between the boys and their mother ended painfully when Victoria tried to force immediate affection instead of respecting their emotional wounds. Matthew withdrew further into silence. David became anxious and insecure again, and Richard struggled to reassure them. But Sarah's calm, dependable presence kept the family grounded. Through everyday acts of care and consistency, she helped the boys feel safe, while Richard gradually realized that his admiration for her had grown into genuine love, based on respect, loyalty, and the strength she brought to their lives, rather than circumstance or gratitude. The turning point came during an ordinary afternoon when David proudly showed his father a drawing of their family that naturally included Sarah, a view Matthew quietly shared. Encouraged by that realization, Richard later confessed his love, promising never to pressure her or jeopardize their existing bond. Sarah admitted she loved him as well, but insisted that any relationship must be built on equality and never come before the boys' needs. After carefully explaining their feelings to the children, they received David's joyful approval and Matthew's cautious but sincere acceptance. Although Richard's sister Laura initially opposed the relationship because of social differences, witnessing the peace and stability Sarah brought to the household eventually led her to abandon her prejudices and develop genuine respect for her. As time passed, Sarah excelled in nursing school, while the family's happiness became a lasting reality rather than a temporary recovery. Richard proudly celebrated her achievements alongside Matthew and David, and later proposed only after ensuring she could choose freely without obligation. Surrounded by the boys, Sarah accepted, and their embrace symbolized a relationship built not on debt or status, but on trust, healing, and shared commitment. In the years that followed, they discovered that true love grows through daily acts of presence, patience, and compassion, and that the greatest legacy anyone can leave is not wealth or prestige, but the enduring safety, kindness, and unwavering care that transform ordinary people into a true family.